Hey everyone. Test. Hey everyone. Cool. Cool. Nice to see you again. We are in our third of these weekly Hangout live streams. Every Wednesday, we're just going to be streaming useful tips and tricks to getting awesome 360 renders out the door. We host these on YouTube and in the Off-World Live Discord also. So to get chatting, hanging out, finding out, answering your more specific questions about 360 rendering, maybe for a certain level that you have. Be awesome to jump in the Discord this time every week, and we can also always look through any specific questions you might have. So we're just putting this time aside to really dive into some deep detail. This week we're looking at rendering tips. We've been tackling 360 renders for a number of years now. Time has flown, but as a result, we've put a lot of time into really getting the best out of 360 renders. There's a lot of settings, and when you're working with very high resolutions, you can spend a lot of time getting a render out, it not quite looking the way you want it to look, and then having to re-render. So hopefully sharing these kind of tips will save you guys a lot of time. And there's just some very useful things that you can put into place to make sure your render comes out clean. And I'm just going to share some experience from all the renders I've done, the things that I feel are the most reliable ways to get awesome renders out. So though this stuff is there are some certain hard rules, there's also a lot of stuff that is kind of level specific. So always there's just the kind of thing of starting off a render at a low resolution, making sure it's looking all good, then going higher resolution as you go on. But hopefully this will save you some time as well. So there's sort of four main things I want to cover with this, being local exposure, motion blur, anti-aliasing, and downscaling. These are kind of the four key things I think to getting your render settings right, getting a beautiful render out as you expect it to come from the engine. So we're mostly going to be looking in the Hillside sample project, UE55, our plugin version 301. So local exposure, let's start off with this. Local exposure is a kind of screen space effect in Unreal Engine that automatically kind of changes the exposure of a scene based on where you are, where you're looking. It's really useful for games because you can keep your viewpoint looking well exposed, whether you're under an underpass, under a bridge or something, or not. So if we use this CineCam and bring out the field of view focal length, so quite far, so we can see a lot of what's going on, similar to a kind of 360 view. And we make sure we've got auto exposure on. So we can see kind of as soon as we turn that on anyway, it's done some automatic kind of re-exposing of the scene based on the fact that we're under this kind of bridge. All of this is really, really blown out, but under here is kind of well exposed. If we change the compensation down, it might be a bit nicer overall. But you get this kind of like blend over time. Maybe going here, I might show this. Yeah, so from here, moving back to here, all the lighting kind of changes over time, and that's Lumen doing its calculations over time based on what's on screen, really. So if you think we've got a 360 camera, it's going to be looking forwards and to the right and upwards all at different times. We can see we get all kinds of different exposures going on. So this is just like no good for a 360 camera because the faces won't match. Like the face that's looking up will be kind of brighter than the face that's looking this way. So by default, we don't let you touch this auto exposure as part of the 360 camera. We have it set to manual at all times. This is great, but as you can see, you're stuck to kind of like one exposure. So, you know, the top of this is totally fully dark, whereas you might want it like this. And then, oh, just got a bit weird with my rotation. Zero that off. Yeah, you might want some, oh, done again. You might want some kind of changes in your exposure. And what I would recommend for that is outputting via EXR, so you have a full tone curve to play with, a full wide gamut of colors and all the color information in your image. But we'll go into rendering via EXRs in another video. It's kind of out of the scope of this. But basically, the main point being this local exposure thing where it this auto exposure thing where it changes as you move around and look around. We don't want that as part of the 360 camera. So as well as keeping this set to manual by default, you can also go into any level sequence you've got and hard set this as a console command. Because as well as that kind of auto exposure setting, we do also have what's called local exposure. And we need to turn that off in at the movie render queue point. So local exposure 0. So turning this off will fix renders that look kind of like this, where as you're coming out of a darker area into a lighter area, you're seeing the kind of edges and seams of what all the different faces are seeing, and kind of lumen's calculation changing over time. So let's see if we can find the fixed version of that. Local exposure off. We can see that we're now kind of set to one clean exposure. Much nicer image, much more kind of what you would expect to see. So that's that local exposure console variable, and that's what that can do to kind of fix your renders, especially in these kind of shadowed kind of areas. And then it's also worth noting about exposure in general, how kind of if you're setting your exposure through a Cinecam, just in engine, it's likely to behave a little bit differently to the 360 camera because it has kind of ISO, which is just the kind of sensitivity to light of the sensor. Whereas we don't have that as part of the 360 camera because it just doesn't behave in the same way in 360. We've also got a fixed focal length of 180 degrees for all of our faces. So the settings aren't exactly the same. So it's kind of recommended to always plan your shots with the 360 camera in mind from the start. Especially if you're planning to make a kind of flat copy of one of your 360 renders in a sort of non-immersive format as a kind of preview or something like that. If you want it to totally match, then it's way more recommended to use the 360 camera from the start, so you know what you're getting. So what you can see here is by turning the pause rendering on and off, we can see that the difference in exposure from this to this is totally non-existent. It's totally the same exposure. And what I'd recommend for getting a flat sort of preview out of a version of your 360 render is to just use the instead of, so we've got a sequence here that's got the 360 camera and the 360 camera cut. So we know we're rendering using that 360 camera. We've got all the settings from it. But instead of loading this, we can just do a deferred render. And if we kind of make sure the resolution is right, you know, if we want 1920 by 1080, we're going to get a square of that instead. So it's going to be 1920 by 1920. And then you just need to crop it down afterwards if you're looking for that aspect ratio. But from that, we know we'll get this exact image, and then we can crop it like so. So that's just something to bear in mind with sort of cameras and exposure, and how they're kind of, the 360 camera is kind of different to the Unreal Cinecam. Next up, we've got motion blur, which is another really important thing to keep in mind, because tweaking these settings can become kind of fiddly, especially when working with very high resolution renders. So we want to save you some time with this as well. And so some examples of motion blur stuff that I've found to be effective is basically just setting your motion blur quality to as high as possible, which is 4, and then motion blur separable of 1. This will give you a kind of longer, smoother motion blur. You can also change your motion blur amount and bring it back down a bit if you have a high quality. And although I was kind of unable to get the examples together in time for this this stream, I can point you towards this really great tutorial on understanding the kind of motion blur separable and what it does. It's this enhanced motion blur with movie render queue, and essentially what he's talking about here is how you can see. We can get to the right point. So here he's doing the same thing with motion blur quality 4 and motion blur separable on. And he's demonstrating how it kind of just smooths out each of the images that is pieced together to then create this blurred image. So I'd highly recommend looking that up if you want to clue yourself up on motion blur quality and this motion blur separable. But also what kind of ties into motion blur is anti-aliasing, which is kind of next thing we're going to talk about. Hey guys, nice to see you tuned in. Why not using 5.6? Because all the renders I was making were made a few months ago, so using the level that I was using before, but we totally have a version for 5.6 up and ready. Yeah, 5.6 is great. So in terms of anti-aliasing, this kind of goes alongside the motion blur points. Here's a little example of how I've got on quite well with spatial and temporal samples, as opposed to just temporal super resolution. If we zoom in on this kind of image comparison, so basically this is a render that was the camera was moving itself, so we've got some motion blur here, and then also this person was kind of running past as well. So zooming in on this person, this is a good example of the hand here. Standard TSR, totally broken up, not handling fast movement well at all. Then we've got 16 spatial and 32 temporal. We can see, so obviously this is the most extreme render. If you're running a really long high-res render with this many samples, it's going to be increasing the render time massively. So, you know, maybe you can get away with a little lower, so we can see these two compared to each other. 16 versus 2 by 8. You can see the separation a little bit between the samples. But maybe you can get away with that for your render. It's all about how long it's going to take you and whether it's worth just upping those samples, So, if you're looking at getting the really best image out of this, bumping your temporal samples up to like 16, up to like 32 can be really good for motion blur. And this is because temporal samples are essentially taking not just the image that you're rendering, it's sampling frames in time before and after the actual frame that's being rendered, and then it's smoothing all of those together. So you might see subsamples coming up when you run a render with temporal samples, and these subsamples are basically doing a whole render of the whole scene many times before piecing together the final render. So this can increase render times massively, and it will increase render times a lot. But it's pretty worth it to remove some of these jagged edges, especially compared to TSR. Really cleaning up that image. You also get it at these kind of edges here. You can see it's totally broken up by TSR. But yeah, with this even 2 by 8, it's a lot nicer. And then this really high, it's a bit nicer again. I'll just kind of explain how to implement that in an actual render and what that means. We go back into our movie render queue config. We've got the anti-aliasing here. And just to show you, I would have a 360 here. I might have some console variables. But as part of this anti-aliasing, you've got spatial sample count. Spatial samples are moving the camera, kind of wiggling, jostling it around, so that the final image can be a combination of this spatial movement of the same shot, and then it can figure out edges of geometry a lot nicer. But that is pretty much all it's good for, as I'll demonstrate a little later. It doesn't improve the overall blend smoothness of everything, like the textures within geometry. It's a little more concerned with edges of geometry. Then temporal sample count is kind of doing this jostling as well, but in time instead of space. So temporal over spatial. So it's saying render not just the frame I'm on, but the frames that come before it, and the frames that come after it, and then merge those together. So yeah, using past frames to blend. Oh, got an auto save going on. Maybe let's jump back to this example again, and how, after explaining that, how you might be able to see. Let's look at this kind of geometry here. These bits. So not a lot of difference here, kind of showing that the spatial samples aren't doing anything else because these edges of these geometry aren't cleaning up anymore. When we compare it to TSR, they really are cleaning up those fine edges. That's because of that spatial movement. And then the kind of motion blur example, this grass is a great example. Really cleaning that up. Cool, let's see if that always stays done. So yeah, to implement these, I would do something like 5 by 11. That's going to create 55 total samples. And then we do need to click override anti-aliasing to none, because essentially what that's saying is don't use TSR, instead use my custom sample count. So TSR is temporal super resolution. It's doing a kind of clever AI upscale in a way. So like AI has actually been around for anti-aliasing methods way earlier than people think. Um, all of these methods employ some kind of AI because they're saying, what should a CG image usually look like? It's being fed data of what CG images should look like, and it's using that data to actually clean this stuff up. I just thought it's kind of fun to know that stuff has been used for this for a long time. So something like this sample count, or as mentioned over here, we can see what these sample counts do for this render in particular. So 2x8 is already doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And then as you get into so that's going to be 16 extra frames for each frame. But then 16x32, for the amount of improvement you actually get, it's like, is it really worth it? Because that's going to be whatever that is more. That's like an insane amount more, So going from 16 extra images to 32 extra images, it's gonna increase your render times significantly. But for the very best image, it might be worth it to you. Again, do some renders of maybe a smaller frame range, like a frame range of 5. See how long that takes you, then multiply that out for your final render before embarking on a massive render at a very high sample count, because you could save time by reducing that. Cool. So more anti-aliasing stuff. I'm gonna do some more image comparisons. This is an example of with a still image that's got a lot of detail. I would actually advise away from overriding the anti-aliasing. It's kind of a matter of preference, but for me, I feel like the FX AA is cleaning up, or kind of retaining a bit more sharpness than the anti-aliasing override in this example. So it's quite a specific example, lots and lots of trees. I'm looking at this kind of area, and I feel like the blurring is maybe not what I'm after for this render. Interesting how the actual lighting is different as well. It could be something else, but I'm pretty sure, this different anti-aliasing method is actually kind of affecting the global illumination. I can't say that for sure. But kind of here, I think this actually kind of softens this edge. Whereas for the more distant, I think, that looks nicer, it looks crisper. I don't know how well you can see on the stream. Sorry about this zoom. This kind of shadow, a bit softer and nicer here. But it's really interesting because it's like maybe we're losing too much detail here. But what I would say overall is if you're looking at making immersive media, you do want to avoid visible pixels at all costs. As soon as you start seeing pixels, the sense of immersion is kind of broken. Some people say you can add a sharpen. I believe this is another console variable. Yeah, tone mapper sharpen. Again, I don't really like this one, but so that's set to 0.5 by default by the looks of it, actually. It's interesting. Maybe I had a post process that was in there, so check out what that's set to by default in your project. But I don't really like this effect. Some people like it. Let's look at this area. So sharpen on this side, no sharpen on this side. It does increase the sense of kind of detail, but it's not adding any resolution. Of course, this is two of the same resolution render, and it's kind of up to your preference. I do quite like what it's doing back here, but overall, what I think when you look at these kind of edges, I think it almost has the effect of a VHS camera, or an old school camera, because they often did have sharpen filters applied, but also just maybe a little too harsh with the sharpen. So you get this kind of embossed edge effect. But you know, these trees and stuff, it's looking less kind of blurred, but more pixelated. So again, personal preference, I would say test this in a headset. See if the sharpen does anything for you. Of course, really important to be testing this stuff in the actual format that you intend to view it in, whether it's a dome or a headset. Going to be totally different once you put the headset on. This is why I'm using this image slider that allows you to zoom as well, because your zoom is going to be really important. You're not going to see, you know, this image looks quite nice quality from here, but really on a headset or in a dome, we're only going to be looking at a quarter of it at a time, if that. So zooming in is very important. But yeah, I don't know, there's some crispness added, but also I think it's a little bit garish for my taste. And again, the visibility of the pixels, I would always say, kind of removes any sense of immersion. I've got another one here, sharpen with anti-aliasing samples as well. So we've got no sharpen and sharpen, but both have 8 spatial, 1 temporal. So this is just a still image. I was just doing spatial samples. Let's check it out in this same spot here. Whoa. Yeah, similar effect. I think the sharpen is kind of being applied afterwards anyway, so it's interesting. I think it is quite nice for retaining some of this further detail. So TSR compared to just 8 spatial samples, which would already increase the render time a fair bit, but not too much. It's quite a low sample count. Let's see what we get. I'd say there's a bit more noise on this kind of edge. Definitely here. A lot more jagged. So this is where I started to kind of get the impression that actually maybe we can just go with temporal super resolution. You know, maybe if we were to just render a higher resolution and downscale it, would that be more effective than meddling with increasing your render times by upping the spatial samples? Because here we're increasing our render time by something like 8 times, and we're not actually getting any better visual quality. Because TSR, the fancy AI anti-aliasing method, is actually doing a really good job in this example. Really smoothing out these bits. Yeah, interesting. So let's go with more samples, see if we can smooth out the image to the point of TSR by increasing the render time even more. Same resolution, but increased render time. I want to get to this bit, yeah. Barely any increase. So as if we've maxed out on the amount of samples that would improve this image already, and we're only at 16. So it's like adding more anti-aliasing samples isn't going to do anything for us for improving this image, for cleaning it up. So again, going back to TSR, way cleaner. So this is what has led me to my favorite kind of method that I think is the best way to get the highest visual quality out of a set resolution, and that is downscaling. So let's get up some more comparisons for this. But essentially, yeah, let's get an image up. Mm. So we've got a 4K render of this spot, and it looks awesome from here. It looks amazing. But you got to bear in mind that on a headset, as I say, we're going to be zooming in by, depending on the field of view of your headset, you could be zooming in by up to like 200, 300%. So it's zooming right in really, really far. And almost immediately, the image breaks up. So this is again the importance of viewing your renders in the final output format as often as possible. What you might end up actually seeing is something more like this. And you're like, I spent ages rendering this huge image. And then, because we're working in immersive media, the actual final output might only look like this, a little bit crummy. This is the kind of massive resource rendering times. The scale of what we're making when we're making immersive media has to be taken really seriously if you want the best output. So, this is totally breaking up. So, as we saw, no matter how many anti-aliasing samples you throw at this, you're not going to gain any more pixels. You're only going to clean off some edges. Or not even. TSR was kind of cleaner for a lot of still images for me. So this kind of leads to why we love ultra high res 360 rendering so much. Because let's look at this compared to I got it here. Yeah, I believe this. So this is a 30K of the same render. And we can see we can just zoom, and you never see any pixels. So this is kind of the only point where I'm starting to see some jagged edges. These things that anti-aliasing is trying to clean up, these kind of jagged edges, they totally disappear by the time you're zoomed in this far. So this is where this stuff becomes really astounding and like reality, which is what we're trying to do with immersive media. We're trying to make it feel real. Let's flip back to this version again. This is starting to feel digital. It's starting to feel like an old school game. Whereas I think this is 30 by 15K, ridiculously big. But if we're looking to make stuff that's really, really astounding, we need to go big, So this is my favorite kind of method, is rendering unbelievably high resolution. So you've just got an image that looks like reality. You can barely break it down by zooming in. Slight edge pixels here. This is just the kind of stuff where it gets truly awesome. Of course, the question here becomes, how do you deal with files this big? So it becomes a bit of a balancing act. What I found is the most realistic for me is to render at 12K or 11.5K, because then I can do that without any tiling on my PC, which is just like a 4090 GPU, 64 gig of RAM, fairly decent computer, kind of computer you'd be using for general Unreal Engine stuff. Nothing super cutting edge nowadays. I can render at 12K without having to do, or 11.5K without having to do any tiling. And then I can downscale to 8K or 6K for the actual playback on the headset. But as you sort of view this in VR, it's often these kind of distance points I'm looking at, because this is where you'll end up kind of gazing in the headset, and where you might start to notice some digital artifacts. But you know, with the fact that you can just zoom infinitely on this without it breaking up, I really think downscaling is the way to go. So you can kind of load this into Premiere. This is a less extreme example because this is a 4K over an 8K. So 4K here, and 8K, 4K, 8K. Just look at these like edges here. You can see a lot of cleanup happening. So 4K, 8K. 4K, 8K. And you know, it's this kind of smudging and noise here being totally removed by the higher res render. Back to 4K, we got a bit of, you know, unclear reflections. Just really cleaned up by just going higher resolution. And this can actually be quicker than throwing lots of anti-aliasing samples at your render. Just going a higher resolution. And then, you know, we're using the fact that Premiere has some nice smoothing. It uses bicubic smoothing as you downscale an image. So you're still working with the same amount of pixels, but it's got that data to work with. That nice image out of Unreal is a great basis. So the things I found are the best is just using TSR, unless you've got some very fast motion or moving objects. Downscaling in something like Photoshop or Premiere, depending on, well, you're probably doing moving image, so Premiere or DaVinci or something. Yeah, keeping your motion blur fairly low. I wouldn't like to, keeping your anti-aliasing samples fairly low. As I say, I wouldn't like to go to something like 32 with a image of very high resolution because that's just going to blow your render times massively. And then using, you know, the correct export settings, which we could go through in another video, to then get the playback of what was a ridiculously high resolution video, but has then been downscaled to something that's digestible for the final headset that you're playing it on, the headset or the dome. Yeah, so those are kind of the main things I would look out for when you're thinking about how to get the best out of a render that you've got there. And ultimately, what I would say is TSR, a little bit of temporal samples if you feel the need to with movement. Motion blur quality, raising that, keeping local exposure off. I can show you the settings here actually while I'm going through this. Local exposure off. What have we got here? Motion blur separable and motion blur quality of 4. And then anti-aliasing, keeping it fairly low, but if you want to, having it around 16, or I would say 16 or less. We see that 32 did clean it up a little more, but I wouldn't recommend it because it bloat render times too much. And then looking at downscaling, render something like 12K, bring it down to 8 or 6K, and then you can play it back on a headset. So that's honestly the key things that would help you get a really clean render out. There's honestly not a lot more to it, but it's taken us a lot of renders over a lot of time to figure out these tips. So hopefully it's really useful. It can save you guys some time. Again, this is kind of level dependent, so things might come up that you might want to talk about in a future Discord hangout. As I say, we do these every Wednesday. Really happy to see some people dropping in, and just really down to share more tips as we go on. We'll be here doing this every Wednesday. What's the res of the 360 render? TSR has some weird ghosting in movement. Yeah, so the res I would say to get the best render out while still being realistic on the fact that you could drag it into Premiere and re-export it at a lower res, I would go 11.5 or 12K if your computer can handle it. And then that's in equirectangular format. If you're doing it in Dome Master, I would say something like 8 by 8K, because again that's square, so you're going to have a lot more pixels to work with. And then yeah, as you say, TSR has some weird ghosting in movement. This is why you would add some temporal samples as sort of outlined in a previous part of this video. Yeah, thanks for dropping in. It's really nice to see some people here, and as I say, this is also open to discussion in our Discord, same time every week. So yeah, hope to see you again. Hope to see you make some awesome 360 stuff. Cheers. Do let us know. Drop in the Discord if you have any further questions. Big thanks.